Hi everyone, and welcome to the Say As It Is with Pete podcast series. I'm Pete, your host, and each week I will bring you some frank and honest conversations covering various topics from learning and development, apprenticeships, funding, HR, strengths, recruitment, ESG, well-being, ED&I, employability, and much, much more. So let's get this week's episode underway and say as it is. Thank you for joining me on this week's episode, and I'm going to have a frank and honest discussion around apprenticeship funding. That's right. Yes, it's about apprenticeship funding, and it's like Marmite. Either you love it or you hate it. And, you know, look, I've been in apprenticeships for a long time now, and I have to say, and trust me when I say this, I love funding. And funding is like my Marmite. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I hate it. So in this episode, I'm going to explain how funding works and kind of ask the question whether funding for apprenticeships is fair or not. And we'll come on to that question a bit later on. But a couple of people have reached out to me on LinkedIn asking me from my recent visit to Scotland for Scottish Apprenticeship Week about funding in Scotland because they were a bit unsure of how it works. So I thought, why not create a little episode around funding so everybody gets an understanding the basics around funding across the UK, because funding is different everywhere. It's different in Ireland or Northern Ireland, it's different in Wales, and it is definitely different in Scotland and in England, obviously. So let's give you a bit of apprenticeship funding history 101. So pre-funding, pre-levy, it was all funded by the government, and it was a lot more easier back then as training providers had access to full funding. So it meant that it didn't come out of the employer's pocket as it does now, and I'll explain how that works later if you're unsure, but it meant that it came from the government. But what the government did back then, pre-levy, was stipulate about funding. So training providers, and if you are a training provider or come from the background, you'll know what I'm saying on this one, that there was a main focus on 16 to 18 year olds and then 19 to 24. And then there was very limited funding for 25 plus. So back in those days, if you was 24 plus, you had no luck of getting onto an apprenticeship. None whatsoever, or back then it was called QCS or MVQs. But that's a little white lie, as some training providers were able to access funding for the 24 pluses. And I came from the provider background, and I knew that there was always a little bit of funding hidden or hidden back, or where we get access to. So when that funding was given, we would be able to go back out to employers and say, hey, look, we've got funding for 24 pluses. Have you got anybody? But the main focus of training providers was the 16 to 18 and the 19 to 24, because that was where most of the largest funding stream came in from. Now, this is where we then come into the lovely levy that came into effect in April 2017. And it was a bit of a nightmare, wasn't it? Because a lot of employers started calling it a tax. And how could they do this as there was an uncertainty of, them being taxed, and the apprenticeship levy became the apprenticeship tax and various other things. And I think there was a lot of discourse when the levy came out, because the government had decided not to fund apprenticeships anymore and push the onus back onto the employers. And this is when apprenticeships had certain funding bands for qualifications. And, look, the bands were, I think there's like 27 different bands at one point, and the funding was set at certain levels. And at a certain band level, you would pay a certain amount. But now, with the Institute of Apprenticeships around, there are boards that sit down and decide how much a qualification costs. And then the providers will then charge that cost. So with the lovely levy, it has now been about 6 years, that the levy's been in place, and it's still going strong. And I don't think it's going to change. It's going to be around the way it is for a while. And there are talks of the levy reform, and that's still to come. But we have to understand that when the levy came out, there were certain incentives that came with it. So if you employ anybody 16 to 18, there was a incentive, especially during the pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, to get people into work. There was a incentive of getting people employed up to where the government were paying, or the SFA were offering up to £3,000 per person that you employ onto an apprenticeship that was new into the business. So there were some benefits. So why talk about funding? Well, if you don't know, the levy is only for England, and Scotland, Ireland, and Wales have their own funding streams. So it's not like you're paying the levy and it covers the whole of the UK. It doesn't. It only covers England. Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales are on their own funding streams. Now, with those funding streams come their own funding rules. And funding rules are funding rules. Now, you're thinking here, Pete, what are you saying? Well, this is where I'm going to share some of my knowledge and explain each funding stream and how it works to the best of my ability, because there are lots of funding rules, and to get your head around them is a lot. So that's why we have training providers. And I know some amazing people out there like Lee Hill, Amy Cooper, and a few others that I can lean upon to check those funding rules. I'm a little bit unsure, but I think it's key to know that although I came from a training provider background, my head is always in the funding rules. And even now as an employer, my head is buried in the Scottish funding rules from the Skills Development Scotland. My head is in the Welsh funding rules. My head is in the DFE for Northern Ireland's funding rules. So my head is funding rules, funding rules, funding rules, and I love reading them. So every year we have funding rules. And for the levy, which is done by the ESFA, it's now that there are three types of funding rules. Funding rules for employers, which as employers, if you do have a levy pot, then you do have to abide by those funding rules. It's part of your DAS account agreement that you agree to those funding rules on what you can spend your levy on and various other things. But there's also employer provider funding rules and main provider funding rules. And as the nerd I am, I always read all three funding rules that come out. So enough about funding rules at the moment. But let's start with England as a funding stream to look at first. So, as I've said, we have the levy now, and there's two ways that this works. Now, the first one is companies with a pay bill over 3 million have a levy, also known as a levy pot. So if you pay over 3 million on your pay bill, you are paying the levy. And this levy goes into a DAS account, a digital apprenticeship system account, and this is where you access it and you pay for your apprenticeships via that system. It's like a digital voucher when you're paying a provider. One piece of advice I give you is do not allow your training provider to have access to your DAS account. It's your responsibility as an employer to maintain your DAS account, and unfortunately, there have been some providers that have misused employers' funding before, and some of those providers that have done that have now disappeared off the face of the earth. So it's down to whoever's looking after your levy account within your L&D or HRD or HR teams to manage that account, and solely and ideally one person only. Now, when it comes to that account, it's key to remember that when you're adding apprentices on via your account, make sure you have the UK PRN number for the provider. When setting up a cohort of apprentices, sometimes it's more easy to set the cohort up with that UK PRN number for the provider and allow access to the provider to add the learner information only. Do not, and I repeat, and this is out of experience from what's happened in the past, not necessarily with me, but from what I've seen in the past, is do not give your personal logins to a provider or create an account for the provider to log in. They will have their own systems, so you don't need to touch it, and never give access to a provider. Now, there may be some providers listening to this and say, Pete, that's not right. But I can tell you from experiences and what I know out there, just make sure when you set up your DAS account, you set it up for your apprenticeship team or your apprenticeship administrators that are doing it. Do not give your providers access. Just let them add the learners on. So you create a cohort, send that cohort number to the apprenticeship team of your provider, but they'll also get notification anyway, and they can go on from their end on their system and add the learners on, and you just get a message to go in and approve. So that's a bit of advice and a top tip. So with that levy, you've got that levy pot going in. But I have to say, if you are an SME, then a small, medium-sized enterprise business, then you don't get a levy because obviously your pay bill's not over 3 million. So this works a little bit different. And this is where I come on to point 2. So if you're an SME, you would only need to pay 5% of the cost of an apprenticeship. And the remaining 95% is covered by the government. Well, I say the government, but it's covered really by the unspent levy that employers have not managed to use up in the 24-month window that we have. And it's a bonus, really. So if you're an SME and you want to put an apprentice on an apprenticeship, you're only going to pay 5% of the total value of the apprenticeship. So, you know, even if it's £200, £300, £400, £500, that is all you're paying, rather than paying the £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, £6,000 for that apprenticeship out of your levy, or having to pay for it commercially. You're only paying that small amount, and that is even still worth it. A small investment from your business for an SME to pay £200, £300, £400 to invest in taking on an apprentice, where 95% of the cost of that apprenticeship will be covered by the government or some unspent levy. So if you're an SME, take full advantage of it. So when we're looking at this and we're taking on apprentices, what we must remember is the kind of working hours that an apprentice can have. So for an apprenticeship in England, the minimum of 20 hours per week. So if a learner works less than 30 hours per week, the minimum length of the program is increased. So there is a calculation for that that is in the funding rules from the ESFA. But you have to understand that ideally you should be putting an apprentice on a minimum of 30 hours. Anything less than that, obviously, as it says, you're going to start then having that apprenticeship expand. So 12 months becomes an 18 months. It could be a 20 month, depending on, their hours. I don't want to say it, but you could put an apprentice on a 0-hour contract. But again, you're going to have to pay for the time that's required for that apprentice to do their learning, because you have to support that and support them, pay for their visits with a tutor, and pay for the off the job as well. So what I would say is try and not put an apprentice on a 0-hours contract. Put them on a minimum of 30 hours a week. Okay. And also advantages of that is that if they are 16 to 24, you don't pay the Class 1 NI, which I have mentioned in a previous podcast for apprentice wages. And then again, as I say, if you take on an apprentice, pay them a fair wage. Now, a little bit of interesting facts with regards to unspent levy. Now, any unspent levy is offered up to the other areas, or the other nations, as I like to call them, for them to access, and used the unspent levy to support with the apprenticeships or funding of the apprenticeship streams in their areas. So that goes to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. They have access to the unspent levy that we don't get to spend as employers, and they get to use that towards supporting the apprenticeships they offer in their regions. Now, let's give you a little bit of history on this. So how much unspent levy has there been? And I ask that question quite a lot. So let's just take a second to look at this. Now, when we're looking at unspent levy, we're looking at the amount of levy that has been unspent since, kind of 2017 up until 2022. So I'm going to go through this a little bit of history. So financial year of 17 to 18, 428 million was unspent. 18 to 19, 493 million was unspent. 19 to 22 is 550 million of unspent levy. And then year 20 to 21, so this is when we were in the pandemic, it slightly went up again to 604 million. And then 21 to 22 is 11 million was unspent. So overall, we're looking at about 2 billion pounds of unspent levy since the levy started in April 2017, and that's a lot. And that information comes from the DFE, the Department for Education, and I was able to obtain this information also from FE Week. So it's quite a lot of funding that is, or levy spend that is not spent by employers. And a lot of employers do say they don't have the means to spend all their levy money. But it's good to know that that levy is put out to the other kind of areas or nations for them to use. So let's look at those other areas and see how they kind of use that unspent levy that they can tap into, but how they fund their apprenticeships. So let's look at Wales. Well, I'm happy to say that Wales fund all their apprenticeships. So they fully fund apprenticeships for anyone aged 16 to 65. And they do have some priority areas where they look at, for example, so like if it's hospitality and tourism, they look at that as a key priority. So also you have to be within that job, and you can't be in that role more than 6 months to be placed on an apprenticeship. You have to be in that role and do an apprenticeship right at the beginning. So when you start a job or start an apprentice in a role, get them onto their apprenticeship as soon as possible to access that funding. But it's good to know that in Wales, the apprenticeships are fully funded. But just out of interest, apprenticeship working hours, they give a minimum of 16 hours per week for that one. So to be on an apprenticeship, you have to be a minimum of 16 hours, but apprenticeships are fully funded, which is fantastic and good to hear. Now, let's look at Northern Ireland. So, Northern Ireland, a little bit different. Apprenticeships are fully funded for anyone aged 16 to 24. But if you're 25 years and above, then there is only the commercial option. So unfortunately, if you're 25 or plus, you cannot access an apprenticeship. And as an employer, you cannot put somebody who's 25 plus onto an apprenticeship because there is no funding. You would have to pay commercially for it. And the commercial cost is dependent upon the provider. But if they're 16 to 24, it is fully funded. And the minimum hours for an apprentice in Northern Ireland is 21 hours per week. So let's move on to wee bonny Scotland. Now, Scotland, which is done by the Skills Development for Scotland. Now, if you are aged 16 to 19 years, then your apprenticeship is fully funded. Now, if you are aged 20 to 24 years, this requires an employer contribution. And then if you're 25 plus, then it's commercial only. So the 20 to 24 means that with the employer's contribution, only a bit like the levy for an SME, only so much is covered, but the rest has to be covered by the employer. So only an X amount of funding will be covered. And normally that's anything from £1,000 to £1,500. So in Scotland, you're probably looking at an average of about £1,500 to add as an employed contribution for an apprenticeship for a 20 to 24-year-old. There are special dispensations for if someone has a learning disability, a drug or alcohol problem, or there are other elements that meet the criteria where the funding would be fully covered. But if not, and you are aged 20 to 24, then as an employer, you would have to pay a contribution that can be anything from up to, say, £1,500 per employee. But again, 16 to 19-year-olds are fully funded. And if you're 25 plus, then there is that commercial cost. And that commercial cost could be anything from, a couple of £1,000, could be from £1,000 to £2,000 to probably £6,000, £7,000, depending on the qualification and the level. So, interesting, right? Now, here's the question. Is the funding fair or not? Well, in my eyes, it's not. Why? Well, Scotland and Ireland have access to unspent levy like Wales, and I feel that they should use it more and stop this age restriction. And this age restriction grinds my gears in basic terms. Times have moved on. An apprenticeship should be open to anyone, regardless of age, especially as the landscape of recruitment changes. So with the levy in England, there is no age restriction. Now, as I stated before, there was a focus on certain age brackets, 16 to 18, 19 to 24, and that was it. So very similar to how Scotland and Northern Ireland are working. Now, because of the age restriction, that was because it was funded by the government. And the government had a key focus on certain age groups. And this age restriction, like I've said in the apprentice wage, needs to be abolished, right? Those days are gone. Under the levy, age restrictions were removed and anybody from the age of 16 upwards could do an apprenticeship. And that was a game changer, massively. And this needs to happen for Scotland and Northern Ireland. They have and can tap into that unspent levy. So why aren't they? Why are they not allowing anybody? Let's look at Scotland, for example. Scotland should fund apprenticeships from 16 upwards, regardless. They shouldn't be saying to the employer, you need to contribute if you want somebody to do an apprenticeship age 20 to 24, or you have to pay the full qualification for 25 pluses. And same for Ireland. They shouldn't be saying, once you get to 25, you have to pay the commercial costs as an employer. That's restricting potential hidden talent out there from coming to join your company. And that's a shame. So Northern Ireland and Scotland, smell the coffee, look at the landscape, it's changing, access some more of that funding from the unspent levy and start funding your apprenticeships. Now, take EasyJet, for example. They just did a big recruitment drive for over 50s, and most of them now are doing an apprenticeship with them for cabin crew. And there is a qualification in cabin crew standards. But if we limit funding to the key age groups, then we limit the hidden talent, as I said before. Now, the over 50s plus, have some amazing hidden talents, some amazing strengths. And there's lots of people aged over 24 or 25 that have some amazing hidden talents, that have not been great in education, may not have chosen the right career path, that come into an apprenticeship and they are amazing at what they do. So kudos to EasyJet for looking at the over 50s and putting on an apprenticeship in England. Now, you might say, for example, and this is in the funding rules, that if somebody works in Scotland but also may work in England, can the English levy or the England levy pay for their apprenticeship? Well, there is a small loophole. If that person spends 50% or more of the time, say 55, 60% of their time in England and the remainder in Scotland, then yes, the apprenticeship can be funded via the levy. But if they spend 60% of their time in Scotland and the rest in England, then it can't. So that's in the funding rules. Now, there are those little loopholes and all those things in the funding rules. So I would suggest if you are still unsure about how to get your head around the funding rules, feel free to reach out to me. More than happy to go through with them and share some basic information with you. But I think businesses need to step up a bit and lobby, especially the Scottish government and the Northern Ireland government, although it doesn't really have one at the moment, but we need to lobby them and say, scrap the age restrictions for funding. Anybody 16 upwards should be able to access an apprenticeship, because the landscape is changing, and especially as the government looks to introduce these new employability schemes like the returnships, and still fund and boost all of these, skills boot camps and various other employability programs that should lead on to an apprenticeship. And if we are trying to do that in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but we're restricted to a certain age bracket, it ain't going to work. Simple as that. So this is where I have my call to arms. So my call to arms is to have businesses, training providers, employability agencies or companies to do their utmost to lobby the Scottish government and the Northern Ireland government to get them to open up and fund apprenticeships for all ages. Age restrictions have got to stop. I said this on the last podcast about apprenticeship wages and the age restriction, where certain ages have certain wages paid. It's got to stop. We should all be paid 10.42 regardless, no matter if you're an apprentice or you're anybody aged 16 to 22. The same with apprenticeships. Everybody from the age of 16 upwards should have the right to have access to an apprenticeship, whether to be upskilled in the workplace or to start a new career in a business as an apprentice. And you're never too old to do an apprenticeship. And there are some amazing success stories I've seen out there during Apprenticeship Week in Apprenticeship Week Scotland or National Apprenticeship Week. So come on, get rid of the age restrictions. Apprenticeships should not be restricted and limited to ages. Come on, wake up and smell the coffee, please, people. So that's all I've got to say about the funding on this one. And as you can obviously see, I don't think the funding is fair. You may think different, and I'm happy for you to reach out and tell me why you think different. And maybe we have another podcast around this and you join me on that conversation. But as it stands right now, funding isn't fair. It needs to change. So, well, on that note, I'm going to wrap up this episode. So thank you for listening. And remember, if you want to join me on any future episodes, then reach out to me on LinkedIn. Although I do have a slight correction to make from last week's podcast on apprenticeship wages. Two slight things that I was contacted on. I just want to say that on the recording, I'd mentioned that the pandemic was on the 23rd of March, 2019. I do know, and I apologize, I got the year wrong. I do know that the pandemic was in 2020. It's a slight mistake. And I referenced the cost of a cup of coffee at a train station being $3.60 or $3.90. I actually meant to say it should have been $4.60 or $4.90. The two little errors I just want to pick up and correct, because one or two of you who listened to me, and thank you very much, reached out to me and said, Pete, you missed a year. Where were you? All the years are wrapped into one. So it doesn't matter. I'm there. So apologies for that. But again, thank you for listening. So guys, again, thank you for listening to this episode. But as always, you can listen to past episodes via Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and a new episode will drop every Monday. So until next time, thank you for listening, and catch you next Monday for another episode of Say As It Is with Pete.